Welcome back to class. To continue our discussions, I think we covered the incremental nature relating to the rollout of reforms, which meant that one could identify a certain speed up associated with how maybe the experiment with one special economic zone eventually went on to be expanded to other parts of coastal China. Maybe the experiment of successful household responsibility system in one particular province was subsequently extended to other parts of China. And similarly, the experiment with ownership of enterprises at different levels, whether it was at the level of villages, whether it was in the city, or if it was a provincial enterprise or it was a state-owned enterprise, we saw how that was also incrementally increasing, and all of it meant that there is a certain improvement in productivity um, in agriculture, in industrial output, productivity which was accompanied by a certain kind of incentivization, which meant that there was greater incentive for managers to produce more. You can imagine an economy as one would sort of assess um, while trying to understand the kind of compounding that happens. An economy that grows at the pace at which China was growing. Year to year, it varied from 9%, 10%, 11% to at times, some years, even 13%. So, for an economy that grew at that rate, even with a conservative figure of 8 to 9% growth rate, one arrives at the doubling of the economy in roughly 7 to 8 years. Whereas the Chinese economy, as I mentioned, was growing in double digits. And this obviously meant that there were certain other kinds of pressures, including improvement in wages, more production, the ability to produce more over and above the planned targets, meant that there was a certain rush to attract maybe workers with better wages in the private sector. So you have the tendency for money supply to increase in the economy, you have inflation coming up. The government, as we had briefly alluded to, passed a series of economic reform milestones, again in keeping with the third wave of reforms which we discussed, which started in 1992. The hiatus we had explained was the period when there was some kind of a ideological tug of war within the party. You can imagine the party and the leadership under Deng Xiaoping producing these double-digit growth rates, eventually leading to improved wages, eventually leading to maybe more people flocking to urban areas, city centers, and the kind of consequent inflationary pressure that resulted in the Tiananmen Square protests as well. And we had discussed that 1989, the Tiananmen Square protests were not just, as is usually described, were not just demands for maybe democratization of China or maybe greater political rights, but 1989 the protests were against the serious kind of inflation that was taking shape in the Chinese economy. And when I say double digit growth rates, I should also say double digit inflation numbers, right? So the average by then would have been around 19%, which is well above what is conventionally considered to be a safe mark for inflation. And so it was in this context that you had a slowdown. Mind you, it was not some sort of an abrupt end, but it was some kind of a fast vehicle being slowed down because of the kind of ideological tug of war that was happening intra-party, right? So, consequent to this period, again, one realizes that there would be resultant problems from slowing down. I mean, here you are growing at double-digit growth rates, producing more, and one of the sort of negative fallouts would be that when you are incentivized to sell over and above your planned targets in the market, there is a tendency to overproduce, which means that there'll be a stock in your inventory which is unsold, and maybe you estimate the market to absorb it, but overall you are sort of in a situation where the market doesn't really absorb it. So given all of these dilemmas, I think Deng Xiaoping, by the time it was 1992, and the third wave is associated with his famous tour of southern China, wherein he went, I think, to one of the industrial complexes in Shenzhen, and there he articulated this famous sentence that to get rich is glorious. And that was enough for settling the debate in the party whether we should go slow or whether we should continue with the reforms. Once Deng Xiaoping put his foot down that stepping on the brakes is not the way forward, but stepping on the accelerator is the way forward in terms of China moving ahead, that marked the beginning of the third wave of reforms. As you can see on the slide in rapid succession, I think many of the points we would have discussed it fundamentally in terms of the strategies that the government would have tried to roll out, but we'll see if we have missed any. In rapid succession, China abolished most of the remnants of central planning and relaxed the bulk of price controls. I think it's useful to remind ourselves that the purpose of having dualistic pricing previously was to make sure that there is some kind of balance between the concerns that the government might have had as far as welfare is concerned, and also to have the market become operationalized. Now when you have some progress as far as executing these reforms is concerned, we find that eventually both the state administered price as well as the market determined prices, they were sort of converging towards one price. So that is where you find that the state relaxes the kind of price controls that were there and allows both of them to come towards a single standard which was market determined. Foreign investors were given significant access to the Chinese domestic market. Again, a very interesting phenomenon. Earlier we had discussed that the initial experimentation, the initial pragmatism, the initial gradualism was basically to also keep the Chinese domestic market safe. You do not want all of a sudden foreign investors who already have good experience in Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan and South Korea to suddenly come to the Chinese domestic market, and maybe you have ownership at all levels. So maybe a village enterprise cannot stand against a South Korean company, and maybe a provincial enterprise cannot stand against some other Taiwanese company. So the idea was at that time to ensure that they use special economic zones to process goods into final products, which are then sent to final destinations like North America, Western Europe, etc. But gradually you also would want to cultivate national champions. How long would you keep your domestic players completely insulated from competition? You also need players, and that's why today when we begin to look at China's status as the factory of the world, I think it's important in this particular context to also understand that companies like ZTE or companies Chongqing Telecom or companies like Huawei and several other companies that form the backbone of um, maybe back-end supply for core inputs, right? So today you might be using um, um, an Apple product, or today you might be using a Sony product, but the manufacturing part, components, these primarily would have been sourced or produced in China, right? So that is the kind of competitive advantage that began once Chinese domestic companies were exposed to competition, right? Exposure to competition always means that firms can only survive if they are good in terms of providing what the market wants, right? So if you're not good, you will eventually end up collapsing, and we see that happening even in today's context. So if you look at previous examples that I mentioned, because they are relevant, if you look at companies like Motorola, right? Motorola for a very long time was pushed out of the market because, as part of market competition, they had competition from other mobile companies like Nokia, for example, or maybe another company which some of you might recollect, HTC, which was into mobile manufacturing. And at that time, Motorola phones, because they couldn't differentiate their products or offer what users wanted, suddenly sort of got pushed out of the market. And now today you see them rebranding themselves, trying to differentiate products, trying to come up with flip phones, foldable phones, whatever, in order to recapture the market, right? So the market has its own logic of um, allowing firms to survive if they are able to compete with each other and then cater to the needs of the market. You find a similar thing happening with Nokia today. I think Nokia itself, beyond a point, was not able to differentiate its products, and so today in the mobile phone market, maybe South Korean mobile phones are much more popular compared to Nokia because they offer much more value addition to the user, right? So it's the market that determines all of this. At one point in time, Nokia was successfully outcompeting the Americans like Motorola, or even the Swedes like Ericsson. These were, the set companies that were there in the market. Nokia came, kicked these companies out of the market, and suddenly you have this phase when you have again American companies like Apple offering products which are able to sort of push aside many of these other brands that came up in the interim. So the idea here in mentioning all of these case studies or examples is to help you understand that competition, particularly the kind of exposure to competition that they began providing, meant that you now had Chinese champions, national champions emerging in different sectors. Adoption of new tax and fiscal systems and devaluation and unification of the exchange rates. I think this is in continuation of the experimentation they were previously trying to do, trying to devalue their currency, trying to unify the government determined exchange rate with the swap market. And this was a continuation of that, tax and fiscal system reforms. So the idea of taxation again is a very interesting mode of incentivization. So if you remember earlier, during the time of the communes, you had backyard furnaces and town and village enterprises servicing the requirements of the commune. The idea was you meet a certain target and the state takes care of whatever workers' needs are there, right? But here tax is introduced as a form of incentivization. So the state is not saying that, whatever you are producing, selling, you don't need to give to me, you can sell it in the market, you can retain the profit. That is the incentivization I have introduced. But for the state to have something in order to fulfill its other obligations, if I have to build a road, if I have to build a port, if I have to build a bridge, where will I get the money from? Instead of the earlier commune system where I was taking care of the entire production and managing the economy, now I introduce taxes and play around with taxes. That's the whole idea, that you take what you need for your other fiscal responsibilities. During most of the first two waves, state workers had remained within their own communities. Again, that's understandable, that it was an experimentation that was going on. All of a sudden you cannot imagine that everybody would land up in Shanghai or everybody would land up in Shenzhen. It was proceeding in a very gradualistic manner. But by the time you reach the third wave of reforms, there was a surge of labor mobility, possibly because SEZs had expanded, coastal development strategy by then had been well laid out. Foreign institutional investors might have set up many more factories than what was the case earlier. And attracted by the opportunities in the emerging private and foreign invested sectors, well-educated young urban dwellers began changing jobs. That's a very interesting phenomenon, that even not just the workers working in the factories, but well-educated urban dwellers began changing jobs, because there were jobs available, there were very competitive wage rates that now the market was providing. Not just the fact that there was ownership at all levels of government, but there was private enterprise, there was foreign enterprise. So there was all kinds of enterprise that allowed you to change jobs. A couple of things that come to mind for us to sort of keep in mind is, one, movement of workers, particularly to different urban centers or to different industrial centers, um, does create some pressure on local infrastructure. So you can imagine a place like Shenzhen, which otherwise would have been, carrying on business as usual. Now suddenly, because of a lot of industries coming in, now suddenly because a lot of workers coming in, there were other pressures that were being felt on the local administration. The pressures could have ranged from providing urban housing to providing urban transport to providing drinking water to managing waste, to basically planning the city. The city was not, maybe not every city is designed to bear the load of such mass kind of movements. One can think of examples from my childhood when there was some visible industrial activity happening in Delhi, right? So there were places like Karol Bagh, there were places like Paharganj, where there was visible industrial activity. But growing up, one found that, increasingly they decided that there has to be some kind of, new zoning laws that are introduced. You cannot have industrial centers in the middle of residential areas. So then you started the capital becoming the NCR, the National Capital Region. So you had other peripheral areas being developed for a particular activity, right? So these are the kind of pressures that are there, because time is passing and the number of people that are there in that particular city are increasing. And so dealing with this, a couple of interesting things that one would like to point out is, A, the administrators were very clear that in terms of local resources, it might create a crisis. So you can imagine that if there is a local, if there is a city which has a certain capacity to handle X amount of population, right? So there would be X number of schools, there would be X number of hospitals. But when you look at mass migration of people, you now are faced with a situation where would we educate the kids of all of these people. So given these practical challenges, China very strictly enforced what was called as the hukou system, right? The hukou system, spelled as Hukuo, right? The hukou system was something that was in existence from the middle of the 20th century. It was basically a household registration system, but the idea was to classify urban residents and rural residents in a manner that, supposing you are a migrant in an urban city, in that particular case, I mean, of course, there might be a lot of technical clauses associated with it, but broadly, the practical implication was, if I am a migrant worker and I have come from another part of China, say I've come from Guizhou to Shenzhen, right? I will not be able to educate my kids in the local public school, right? Now, when I say local public school, if you think, is that a big deal? It is a big deal, because public school education in China is pretty good, right? And if I am a migrant worker, the other option that I have in that particular case is to send my kids to a private school. But then private school costs a lot, right? So because of this hukou or household registration system, what happened was, when migrants were coming to these cities where a lot of industrial activity was taking place, they could not bring their families for practical reasons, right? Because again, as a migrant, you may be able to put up in a bunker bed and work for a factory or an industrial complex, but you can't do that when you have family with you, right? And many of these urban centers started becoming more and more expensive. You can imagine it's a demand and supply equation. When you have this kind of demand, wages are increasing. You will not find places that are really affordable for you to, host your family. So the interesting bit that was happening with these rollout of reforms was a certain pattern of consumption developed. Now, what is that pattern of consumption? If I am a migrant worker coming to an urban center, I know I cannot educate my kids in the public school. I know I don't have the money to educate them in a private school. The only option left for me is to keep my kids back in my hometown where my household was registered, where my huko was registered. This means that you have a certain pattern of consumption emerging. And what would that be? A person whose family is in his hometown would not be spending the money that he gets from the factory, the wages that he's earning, would not be spending it in the city. Instead, he would be remitting it to the hometown where he came from, because he has his parents to take care, he has his kids to take care, he has to send them to school. There is no point him spending beyond a certain limit. I'm not saying that he won't spend, but it's an obvious point that a large part of that money that he was getting began to be remitted to rural areas, right? So this is a very interesting thing to keep in mind, because whenever we talk of China's economic growth, the one thing that people usually spell out, and you may have come across different articles or editorials, is that the Chinese, they do not spend a lot, right? So there's a constant criticism that the Chinese do not spend a lot, and if you're wondering why, this was a very important reason for that, right? The other reason you have to draw from one of the earlier lectures where I spoke to you about financial intermediation in the Chinese economy, how banks are primarily lending to state-owned enterprises and how banks are primarily catering to those particular enterprises, and private enterprises have to rely on money which is borrowed from other sources, or relatives, friends, or other sources, pooling together their savings. There also the pattern is pooling together their savings in order to invest into business. So when you have more savings, of course that means that you don't have that much for consumption. If you look at corporate behavior and compare it to household behavior here, it's a similar behavior. You have savings and you want to send it back to your hometown, and you're not spending it in the city. So I just want you to keep in mind certain reasons why a kind of pattern emerges. If I were to contrast this with the Indian case or the American case, I am sure all of you are familiar with the understanding that the American economy primarily runs on consumption, right? After that, if you were to compare our performance, we can compare our performance with economies like Thailand, where we tend to consume, and that contributes to economic growth, but not as much as the Americans, right? And then when you look at Chinese consumption patterns are even lower, right? This doesn't mean that in absolute numbers they don't have the money. Please don't mistake it to be a case that in absolute numbers they are not buying phones or they are not buying cars. The fact is that as a proportion of their GDP, the amount that they sort of keep aside for consumption would be lower, right? I want you to keep that particular point in mind. So a certain pattern related to household registration system and the pressures of urban centers created this model of consumption, created this model of saving, right? The other interesting bit is a certain thinking that went in the minds of the leadership relating to the one-child policy, right? Many of you are familiar. In the 80s, they began to enforce it. The idea primarily being that, as I mentioned, if you have a cake, if your denominator is increasing every year, year on year, their thinking was that larger denominator means an overall smaller slice of the cake being available for people, not thinking that a larger, steady, healthy, natural rate of population growth, as has been exhibited by economies like the US, India, for example, where this has actually contributed to improving, the consumption base, improving the consumer base, and as well as contributing to the workforce. Like today, when we talk of the Chinese demography, the biggest challenge for the Chinese today is to deal with an aging population. An aging population coupled with very poor fertility rates. What do you mean by fertility rates? Fertility rates refers to the number of kids a lady can have during her childbearing phase, right? The number of kids a lady can bear during her childbearing phase. Now, with reforms, with improving opportunities, what you had was more and more females coming into the labor force, right? What happens when more and more females come into the labor force? Intuitively, their marriageable age increases. So, the number of years that she has for her childbearing phase, it reduces. Do you understand the working of this phenomenon? That the more you have people coming into the market because of this kind of attraction, it's a good thing that you have more female participation, but B, there is this natural result that maybe the marriageable age keeps on going higher and higher. The higher your marriageable age gets, the lower the fertility rates become, right? I hope you understand how this works out. So this created a consequent problem that along with that one child policy, along with declining fertility rates, along with increased female participation in the labor force, you suddenly had this problem of a demographic challenge that emerges. And I have explained to you the underlying dynamic, right? Most people would just tell you the numbers that in 10 years 50% of China would be above the age of 60. But the reason for that is these set of policies that played together and created this situation. So with that one child policy, the thinking was that eventually people might get a bigger slice of the cake, ignoring in the process the fact that the cake itself could have become bigger and bigger had they allowed a normal, a natural rate of population growth. If you are thinking of other examples where this natural rate of population growth has been arrested, you can think of the crisis that is coming up in places like Japan. You can think of the crisis that is coming up in places like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, all of these places. All of these places, there has been a similar pattern where the natural rate of population growth has reduced to an extent that now they are dealing with an aging population, right? And the biggest consequence of this is very intuitively, old people do not keep changing phones. Consumption is going to go down. Old people will not be changing their LED TVs from a 42-inch to a 55-inch to a 60-inch, right? Old people will not be changing clothes at the pace at which a young population might be consuming, right? I'm just giving you examples. You can fit in, the numbers and the data from whichever economy you want to look at. But overall, this is going to be the case. And old people will not form the backbone of your industrial workforce, right? So if you want industry, manufacturing, people to work in the factory, you cannot have a population demography that looks like what I just described. So these were things that were also being put in place as a result of the kind of reforms that were being rolled out. And it's very symbolic, the kind of consequence that you see in China. I mean, somebody who's smartly suited up alongside maybe a daily wage worker, tired after a long day's work, right? But this went on to become the reality of China. Just to recap some of the key features, and I have discussed every single one of these 9 points in the course of our lectures. The dual track system, basically the two sets of prices that allowed them to experiment with operationalization of market signals through market pricing along with the state administered price. Growing out of the plan meant that the plan that initially might have been large eventually become smaller and smaller as the economy around the plan increases. Entry of private players becomes a hallmark. Entry of foreign players becomes a hallmark, allowing for exposure of Chinese companies to more competition. Prices that equated supply and demand, eventually you find the convergence happening of state administered prices and the market determined prices. So there is that convergence that happens. Incremental managerial reforms in the state sector, again something that resulted from the contract responsibility system in industry, which allowed enterprises to expand production, retain profits, and then that cyclical process of expanding production further. Disarticulation, this is what I referred to when I mentioned the kind of experimentation they were doing with special economic zones in one part. If it succeeded, scale it up. If it doesn't succeed, close it down. So that was the idea of disarticulation. You focus on something at a small scale. If it works, then you go ahead with it. If it doesn't work, stop it. Initial macroeconomic stabilization achieved through the plan, again a very interesting dynamic, that you keep the plan because you need some stability. You suddenly cannot have workers being laid off. You suddenly cannot have production of essential commodities not happening because somebody feels that the market is giving you better returns for some cash crop. But you want macroeconomic stabilization, and that you can achieve by keeping the plan. The plan becomes relatively smaller and smaller and smaller as your economy grows around it. And lastly, continued high saving and investment by households, right? I'm sorry, point 8, macroeconomic cycles throughout the reform process. The cycles being a boom that would have been followed by some kind of a retracement, some kind of a consolidation, followed by a boom, and that kind of cycles that the economy went through meant that they were able to deal with these problems as policymakers. They were able to deal with a scenario where high growth rates produce certain consequences. High growth rates produced inflation. How do you deal with it? You tinker with interest rates, you tinker with devaluation, you tinker with other strategies, and then sort of try and deal with these cycles, whether it was a boom cycle or a bust cycle. And the last point, continued high saving and investment by households. Basically, the reference here being that this kind of growth and this kind of migration and this kind of movement of people to different urban centers also produced a certain kind of saving pattern that I just mentioned, that you don't spend everything in the city because you don't have family there and you want to send it back as remittance to the place where you're living. And in your hometown, again, just bear in mind, it doesn't matter if it's a Chinese village or if it's an Indian village. There is only that much consumption that is possible in any village in the world, right? I mean, you don't find that in a village people would be changing cars every 6 months or every year or every 2 years. It doesn't happen like that, right? So there is a certain pattern of consumption which was entrenched by virtue of these kind of movements, right? And this brings us to again the point where we started out, right? Deng Xiaoping's amazing contribution in bringing out the number varies from 400 million to 800 million, and that is an absolute fantastic achievement, right? You are looking at anywhere between 400 to 800 million, and we can stick with the conservative amount, conservative number of 400 million, but nonetheless bringing out 400 million people out of poverty in a span of 3 odd decades. That just speaks volumes of the human spirit. I think it doesn't matter which part of the world you are in. It doesn't matter if you are an American or an Indian or a Chinese. I mean, the fact that you can bring people out of poverty and you can improve their lives in just about 3.5 decades just means that there's so much that can be actually done in order to improve human life, right? And coming back, there was this articulation that Deng Xiaoping made. It doesn't matter whether the cat is white or black. It's a good cat as long as it catches mice. Again, the reference being to, don't be stuck up on ideology, right? If your ideology is producing results like the failure of the Great Leap Forward or a man-made famine, there's no point in sticking to that. Your cat is only as good as it's able to deliver, as long as it catches mice. Seeking truth from facts, that's also a very interesting point that he makes. Seeking truth from facts. There can be facts and there can be facts, right? Today when you talk to people, they would always bring you numbers which make things look very optimistic, right? Some people might say that, this is the best time the world is going through. There would be another set of people who will give you numbers saying that, what are you talking about? I mean, there is virtually, for the last 6 months, the secondary markets seem to be collapsing. In terms of data, there can be two views, whether you have more jobs or whether you have static growth. In terms of all kinds of data, you can have different facts. Deng Xiaoping's point was, seek truth from the facts, right? Don't just get stuck with, maybe a conservative thinking that, the party is always right, or this is the only ideology that works. If something is wrong, call it out. Seek truth from the facts, right? And crossing the river by stepping over the stones, again, this was something I mentioned that referred to experimentation, that referred to gradualism, that referred to pragmatism, right? And we see that being accomplished over the course of the reform years. Just to sort of also give you a peek into that massive transformation that happened, and these are numbers, and if you actually look at how the numbers play out, roughly 1978, at the start of reforms, India is slightly above China, 1978, when the Chinese rolled out reforms. And what you see there onwards, a massive difference in the growth trajectory that you find, right? And of course, when you update these numbers to 2025, I mean, even with COVID, even with the last couple of years, maybe there is an aberration in overall global data, but I think the overall shape of this particular trajectory is not inaccurate, even for a comparison today. There were other developments, of course, once reforms were rolled out through these three waves, starting from 1992, they just sort of went ahead. And you find that, by the end of the century and the turn of the 21st century, you find that there are other developments wherein China sort of gets into maybe a bigger embrace of foreign trade, maybe more integration with global production chains. Some of these timelines that are important to keep in mind: China's accession to the WTO 2001 meant that the Chinese had to further reform their economy. What do you mean by further reform the economy? Even if there was some kind of tariff barrier that they were using to protect domestic companies from competition, entry into the WTO meant that you had to accede to policies like the most favored nation status, the MFN status, that you have to give to every other country. What this means is that, just because I like country X, I cannot charge a lower tariff from country X, and just because I don't like country Y, I can charge a higher tariff to country Y. WTO doesn't allow that. The only exception WTO gives is for the national security clause, right? So national security clause is when you say that trade with this particular country is resulting in some kind of vulnerability for my national security. That is when you can use any kind of barriers, right? So when you look at countries dealing with each other, the restrictions that they place against other countries will be always on the basis of national security, right? If you've been following the debate about what's happening in the US, the restrictions that they place on Mexico would be because of the threat to domestic American security as a result of certain products that they mention, right? If you look at India, Pakistan, the restrictions that would be placed on the basis of certain restrictions that are allowed on the national security exception. But aside from that, you have to accede to the MFN policy, the most favored nation policy, which means that every partner is the most favored nation for you. You do not have that ability to distinguish between I like country X and I don't like country Y. That's not how international trade would work. It has to work based on a certain predictable policy. The Chinese, as a result of this opening up and embrace of international institutional membership, further embrace of international trade, further embrace of foreign investments, had to drop their average tariff rates from roughly 41% to 5 to 6%, right? That's a huge drop. And when you drop tariff rates, the purpose of having higher tariff rates is to protect your domestic enterprises. You want to make sure that if some other country is selling a good at 20 rupees, by having a 40% tariff, you are making sure that that product becomes priced at 28 rupees, right? And that would be something which your domestic manufacturer would be comfortable with. That is why you have this tariff barrier. But now, by having that reduction in tariff barriers, because you have to have a more open policy and lower tariff barriers, they had to do that. And this also ensured that maybe the Chinese companies that were uncompetitive, they also had to find ways to either be competitive or to move to some other business where they would have been good at. What these years of reform also show us is that fantastic rate of growth that I just mentioned, right? When you grow at 10%, 11%, and the average they give for those 3 decades would be around 10%. That number would have reduced in the last few years for obvious reasons, right? You can imagine the 2008 financial crisis playing a part. You can imagine the subsequent crisis in the Eurozone playing a part. You can imagine COVID playing a part. You can imagine the overall state of the world economy currently playing a part, because of which it might have reduced. I don't know, it might be in the range of 6%, 7% now, but for those years, you can safely think of it as being in double-digit growth figures. And when you add that to the example that I gave of compounding, you can just imagine how China, from being the economic size of Italy in 1978, and this is an actual point in fact, Chinese economy in 1978 was the size of Italy's economy, and today it has gone on to become the second largest economy in the world. Also a point in fact, right? Nothing assumption, no hypothesis, actual facts placed, right? China goes on to become the second largest economy. Since 1978, you find 400 to 800. Those are the actual numbers I have come across. But even with a conservative number, like I said, China managed to take care of 75% of the world's total poverty reduction of the last century. And that is a big thing. As human beings, I think the fact that you are able to sort of bring so many people out of poverty is something phenomenal, right? I think that's the purpose of policies. That's the purpose of leadership. That's the purpose of making sure that you deliver on promises. And of course, this was accompanied by China's recognition on the world stage as well. I mean, it was not that we were looking at an agrarian China transforming to an industrial China and just being there, but you find that globally, whether it was the Newsweek, and on the cover of Newsweek you have this very popular Chinese actress called Chang Sei, right? If you follow mainland China movies, you may have come across this director called Chang Yimou, right? And I think it's a good thing to also, when you study China as a subject, to also maybe get a sense of what kind of craft and what kind of art comes out of that place. So if you look at movies by Chang Yimou, it's a completely different treatment of human emotions. It's a completely different treatment of the different plots that they try to show. The other lady, you are quite familiar. I think she was Liu Yang, from what I remember. Yeah, she was the first Chinese astronaut to go to space. And you had Chairman Mao on the cover of Time, them discussing possibly the transition that happened after Chairman Mao. And then in one of the quadrants, I also kept a picture of the maglev train that connects downtown Shanghai to the airport, right? And I think that runs on the technology of magnetic levitation or something. It's different from the high-speed rail network, but yeah. So I'll leave it at that. More when we meet in the next class.